One of the How did Napoleon equip his army? Napoleon's army of the First French Empire from 1804 to 1815 was one of the biggest that Europe had ever seen. The levée en masse, which was conscription, lent to millions of Frenchmen joining the army, and they all needed guns. The predecessor to the army of the empire was the army of the French Revolution, which had the same levée en masse, and they were the ones that came up with how to equip these men. See, France had one of the biggest arms industries in Europe. See, every other nation had artisans, and what they would do was they would contract these artisans, collect all the individual pieces of the weapons that they made, and then they would usually be assembled in a government foundry. Alternatively, the entire musket would be made by these artisans and then sold to the government under contract. However, from the start of the 18th century, the French did it in a slightly different way. They had the town of Saint-Étienne. It was described as having over 30,000 inhabitants, all working on gun manufacturing. It was a town of smoke and coal, and it was known as the Den of Vulcan. But this still wasn't enough for the French. By the time of the Revolutionary Wars, they needed more guns than they had ever needed before, and while they were making more than anyone else in Europe, it was still not enough. So they took an extra step. In 1792, the French Revolutionary government mandated to support the new army that was now battling to defend France's borders. They needed more and more and more, and they would need more under Napoleon too. So the Council of 12, including Carnot, the great military organizer of the French Revolution, decided that it was finally time for the government to completely take over. They took all these disparate artisans and they put them all in government workshops, collective government workshops all over the country. One of the biggest was in Paris. The traditional system of the artisans was replaced with masses of basically assembly line workers. Their jobs were much smaller. The skills required were much less because they were each doing an individual task that required a lesser amount of skill. Their pay was considerably lowered and their work weeks became massive, up to 10 hours a day. On top of this, they used the revolutionary calendar, so they would get 1 in every 10 days off. It might have been a pretty drastic measure, but it was needed and it worked. The Charleville musket, which the French were producing, became the most mass-produced musket in Europe at the time. Over 2 million were produced at a rate of nearly 1,000 a day at its peak, which may not sound like a lot, but for the 18th and early 19th century, most certainly is.